Well, I want to continue on this front, talk about what we can expect at the G20, but also the tax cut debate back here. Joining me now is the Trade Minister and the Acting Treasurer. Are you also Acting Foreign Minister as well?
No, there's a few things on the go, Mr. President.
Right, OK. A few of your colleagues away taking
just a quick
post-election break.
Few days of leave.
All right, well, acting all of the above and Trade Minister, the G20, what would be the measure of success this week there?
Well, the Prime Minister goes, firstly with a priority around the countering violent extremism online agenda and picking up from the horrors of the Christchurch massacre, and so he's been making, as has the rest of the government, strong representations to other nations to embrace.
So that all social media companies do have to do better at bringing down violent videos and the like.
That's right, to step through getting those social media companies to recognise that they have responsibilities in terms of ensuring this type of content should not be allowed to spread, that they should act swiftly if somebody is doing it.
Have the Americans agreed to this?
No, not as yet, but
they're the ones
certainly been engaged.
Right? As the host of some of these big companies we're talking about.
Well, they're very important in terms of their cooperation, and this is not about curtailing, obviously, free speech. In many cases, these are activities that are illegal in any other format. And it's just and of course the acts themselves are horrific, highly illegal incidents. So it's just about making sure that in terms of the way those social media companies operate, we've got clearer, stronger rules to prevent the spread of that, not just for the fact that that of course has an impact upon the people who see it, but also of course to remove it as a tool for terrorists to use in terms of promotion of their activities.
What about on the trade front? What does Australia want achieved this week at the G20?
Well, we would love to see a real commitment to ensuring that some of the unfair practices around global trade are addressed. So there's an agenda to try to conclude negotiations around unfair and unsustainable fisheries subsidies this year through the World Trade Organisation, to get all countries to commit to resolving those negotiations and make that happen this year.
Who's the worst offender there? Is that Japan?
No. I mean, I think in that sense you're looking more at countries who have unsustainable stocks in terms of the take of fish,
right.
The subsidies that occur there. And of course, many of these countries have been through different stages of development, and so you've got to step through how it is you can address their local economic situations and circumstances in a manner that brings it back to a sustainable level for their economy, for fish stocks and for the environment as well.
All right, so giving our fishers a better chance. The big moment's going to be, though, the meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, which will happen at the end of the G20 meeting. What would Australia like to see happen there?
Well, we would love to see an end to the trade conflict that has certainly been depressing global economic circumstances and prospects for stronger global economic growth. And we've seen that in terms of forecasts from the OECD and the IMF, who've looked at the downturn in projections of growth in global trade and how that flows through into a downturn in projections for growth of the global economy. And of course, that then impacts upon each and every economy around the world. Now, there are valid concerns on both sides in terms of the use of unilateral tariff measures that the US may undertake, but also in terms of concerns about ensuring security of intellectual property and that there aren't unfair subsidy practices in industrial areas or otherwise.
So just to break that down, China needs to stop ripping off intellectual property and the US needs to stop unilaterally jacking up tariffs.
Well, we think all of those issues ought to be addressed. Now, none of them are easy in terms of stepping through and making sure you have proper safeguards around intellectual property, that you deal with unfair subsidisation practices. But ultimately, the world has been served over a period of decades now incredibly well by having a rules-based arrangement for global trade.
And that's being flouted right now, isn't it?
It isn't perfect, and it's never been perfect.
But it's not working when the US and China are just unilaterally stacking up the tariffs against each other.
And yet the benefit that we point to is the fact that over this period of time, as global trade has grown and the economies of the world have grown, so too have hundreds of millions of people been lifted out of poverty. And so opening up economies, opening up markets and embracing trade has served the world incredibly well. It served us as a nation very well. We now routinely record trade surpluses as a nation. That's helped to fuel jobs and economic activity in Australia, but it has also served our region very well.
So what happens if they don't reach a deal, these two most powerful leaders in the world? What will that mean for the Australian economy?
Well, continued uncertainty, or indeed a continued depression in terms of the rates of global trade, will not be good news for any economy.
Will it hurt Australian economic growth?
It will hurt economic growth globally, and that will have an impact on pretty much each and every nation,
particularly though, given our reliance on these two countries?
Yes and no. And there could also be, depending on what occurs, short-term or even medium-term upsides that if trade in some areas is suppressed between those two economic powers, that may well create opportunities for Australian farmers, for Australian businesses to fill certain voids.
Short-term, we could gain out of this.
Well, that's quite possible, and so it's a case that we take the long-term perspective of saying weaker global economic growth is bad for everybody, including us. We'd rather see this type of trade dispute avoided. We urge the parties to keep talking, but you've also got to be realistic here, and that is Australia can't fix these problems, nor can any other country at the G20. We can speak of our opinions and give our urgings to the US and China to do everything possible to end that trade conflict. But ultimately, that's a matter between the two of them. What we can do as a government is make sure that our access to other markets is as strong as possible, to make sure that our economy is as resilient as possible, and they're the things that we keep doing on our trade agenda, on our tax agenda and elsewhere. Let's
talk about the economy here, because the Shadow Treasurer today at the Press Club really went after the government on economic management, pointing out debt has doubled, wages aren't growing much, Australia's gone from 8th to 20th in the OECD when it comes to economic growth. The Reserve Bank's cut interest rates to an historic low. It's signalling it's going to go further. How would you characterise the Australian economy right now?
Well, the Australian economy has good, strong, sound fundamentals. Our rate of economic growth relative to the world's largest economies in the G7 is incredibly strong, sitting at the second compared to those others in the G7. In terms of our budget position, we've been applauded by the international ratings agencies for being able to get our deficit under control, for handing down a surplus budget, and for having a trajectory to pay down debt into the future.
Well, they're planning a surplus budget anyway.
Well, no, we've handed down a surplus budget. Now, of course, what we expect is
we're not in surplus just yet, though.
No, and I think the language is accurate, David. We handed down a surplus budget.
A forecast surplus budget.
And that's what a budget is. A budget is for the year ahead.
Indeed. Anyway, we had this debate during the campaign, I know. But do you think everything's fine?
I think my words were quite precise.
OK. Do you think everything's fine then with the economy?
No, look, there are always issues to deal with in the economy. Type of global issues we were speaking about before in terms of the impact on global trade. Other issues that come along that are beyond the control of governments, such as, of course, the prolonged drought. I would expect to see impacts in terms of some of our exports as a nation because of a downturn in production in the agricultural sector, and obviously agriculture remains a key part of our export mix. Okay. But all of those things are factored into our economic projections.
But you agree we need to get a bit more growth in the economy right now? It's not good enough.
We are focused on continuing to try to get the strongest possible growth we can out of the Australian.
Is it strong enough now?
It is an economy that has been performing and is performing at strong levels.
Is economic growth strong enough now?
Well, it is as strong as we can make it now, but we want to keep driving the reforms to make it even stronger and even more resilient.
So this is as good as you can do right now, is what you're saying?
On all of the circumstances we've been dealing with as a government, we have delivered record jobs growth for Australians, got record numbers of people off of welfare and off of unemployment benefits. We've managed to bring the budget back to that point of handing down a surplus budget, as we spoke about before. So in that sense, we've got some great achievements. The PM yesterday outlined clearly the economic agenda for the future.
Well, let's talk about that.
How we drive productivity through...
Labor's idea yesterday on tax cuts is to bring forward stage 2 of the tax cuts to right now, so that everyone gets a tax cut in this term of Parliament. Is that a good idea?
Well, it's rather inconsistent. Labor's sat there arguing against elements of the tax package, saying that it's fiscally irresponsible. Then they say we should bring forward parts of it and do it sooner. Now, in the end, you can't have your cake and eat it too in that argument.
Their argument is stage 2 gives everyone a tax cut. Why not do that now?
Well, we've thought about it in a carefully staged way that we think reflects the type of variabilities that we might see in future budget forecasts. This is about making sure that you have tax cuts that you believe are affordable, that meet our economic objectives of getting growth into the economy and ensuring that tax cuts help to drive household consumption as well as incentives to work harder and work that extra shift. And that's part of the agenda behind getting rid of bracket creep for the vast majority of Australians, more than 90% of Australians who would see themselves as not paying any more than 30 cents in the dollar under our tax reform measures. But you've got to make sure as well that these steps are appropriately sequenced so that they're affordable too, and that's what we've done carefully to protect the surplus.
Protecting that surplus is more important than driving a bit more growth right now.
Well, we'll respond to any circumstances that come along, but based on the analysis we can do to date, having looked at the impact of things like the drought, looking at the impact of things like the trade disputes, and all of that feeding into our economic forecasts, we think we have projected reasonable budget surpluses each year into the future that are affordable, that can sustain the type of tax cuts that we've proposed. Labor, as I say, are trying to mount an argument that says it's fiscally irresponsible to do it in 2024, but yet somehow you can afford to do even more sooner.
Well, their concern about that stage 3 tax cuts that they're still resisting is that they're not sure it will deliver. These $95 billion will deliver that much bang for the buck for the economy. Is there any modelling to show what growth we'll get out of that stage 3 tax cut?
Well, once again, the modelling that sustains and supports all of our economic agenda is there in the budget papers outlining the forecasts for economic growth and the forecasts for wages growth.
So there is a figure that says what growth we'll get out of stage 3?
Well, in terms of what the growth looks like once you get out to 2024 and beyond, that's all part of the medium-term projections that we have in the budget.
But not a specific breakdown of what stage 3 equals in growth.
Well, not a specific in terms of picking that one element out, because you're looking at the whole range of different factors that occur. Now, what is the unlegislated part of stage 3? It is to take the 32.5 cent in the dollar tax bracket that applies for people earning between $45,000 and $200,000 and turn it into a 30 cent in the dollar tax bracket. Now, that's going to be a significant benefit to households earning wages from $45,000 up. Enormous
right up beyond 200,000.
Right. Well, of course, and that's what happens with any adjustment to the tax brackets at the lower levels, that it flies right through the entire wage index above that. But this is not about the thresholds. The thresholds have already been legislated. Now, I see Jim Chalmers today musing that perhaps Labor might seek to revisit that which has already been legislated. I think they've clearly, in that sense, forgotten that they lost the election. What's legislated is there and is locked in. What we want to see is the remainder of the agenda put in place. And why on earth is it that the Labor Party would stand against reducing the 32.5 cent in the dollar tax rate down to 30 cents in the dollar for wage earners that start at $45,000?
Let me ask you, the Prime Minister yesterday also flagged some industrial relations reform might be on the way to try and get the economy moving a bit more. One of your colleagues, Luke Howarth, reckons if it's easier to terminate staff for small business, more people might get jobs. Do you agree?
No, I think what the PM did yesterday was set out very clearly the type of preconditions that have to be met for any consideration of industrial relations reform. It was a broad-ranging economic speech. He spoke about the importance of tax relief. He spoke about the importance of openness to trade. He spoke about the importance of dealing with red tape reduction and relieving the regulatory burden on business. And he also said to business, and was really saying to business, if you want us to go further than what's currently in our industrial relations agenda in terms of the measures to improve the integrity of industrial organisations, here are the preconditions that we set out, preconditions that ensure workers are not worse off, but in fact workers benefit, preconditions that it drives productivity and efficiency in the economy. So to that end, you won't be making it any easier to sack staff? No, it's not the government's policy, and it's not what the Prime Minister was talking about yesterday.
So you won't do that?
No, David. The PM was talking about very clearly to business to say, if you want us to consider other changes, you've got to demonstrate how it benefits your employees, how it benefits Australian workers and drives productivity.
Right, final one. Peter Dutton, I'm not sure if you've seen this today, but in our documentary Bad Blood tonight, he suggests Malcolm Turnbull offered him the deputy leadership in the middle of that messy leadership week. I know you weren't in the room, but is Peter Dutton generally a truthful colleague, do you find?
Yes, look, I find all my colleagues to be generally truthful, David. Look, these matters, I mean, you've got your documentary that's airing tonight. I think the Australian people cast their verdict on these matters on May 18, and it's a verdict that puts them firmly in the past, and the PM and I and the team all are and need to be looking firmly to the future.
But my point is, Peter Dutton's not the sort of bloke who makes stuff up.
People can sometimes have differences of opinions around conversations that happen, particularly in the heat of the moment. I know that there are conflicting events around those conversations. I wasn't part of the conversation between he and whoever he had the conversation with. If it was Malcolm or anybody else, that's a matter for them.
Simon Birmingham, Trade Minister, Acting Treasurer, Acting Foreign Minister and everything else you're doing right now. Appreciate your time this